think on both of the trips, if I remember rightly, before we left, there's pictures in Mike's book of us all gathered on the steps. But we were taken into the old cathedral just to look at the cross of nails and the charred cross, to remember why we were doing it. Because I think probably one of the main things that grew with us as part of it was the mission of Coventry as a city and of the cathedral as a part of the city, which was the reconciliation message.
Yep.
And that's why it was so important for us to go to Berlin and also to Ottobrunn the year after to actually give that message and take the cross of nails to the Germans, you know, and we felt very proud to be doing that.
I was 10 when the consecration, I was 12 when we went to do the War Requiem. And so, I mean, I think, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I obviously knew that, Benjamin Britten was a very, very, a rock star composer. The War Requiem itself, I hadn't heard it. It was quite moving, particularly with some of the poems of Wilfred Owen. But at the time, I mean, it was 50 years after the start of World War I. The Vietnam War was going on, so every night on the news you saw fighting and battles, and so it was incredibly relevant. And so that whole sort of movement of reconciliation, was very important.
I think that we did have a concept of being ambassadors. I don't think it's false memory to say that. We were immature little boys in many ways, but really quite sophisticated in terms of the mission of Coventry Cathedral. The precentor inculcated us in this concept of forgiveness and reconciliation, and we all bought into it big time. And when we were actually singing in the War Requiem and listening to the words of Wilfred Owen, we had images of East Berlin in our minds. And without the experience of the consecration and East Berlin, I don't think our involvement in Ottobrunn could have been quite as moving.
I was a very young, 12-year-old, lived in Warwick, small town, so this was all very exciting. It was one of the first times I'd been on a plane. I remember we flew to, I think, Frankfurt, and we saw Mary Peters and Anne Packer, who were on the way back from Tokyo Olympics. I remember our coach driver's name, Klaus, and there was one time when he got a speeding ticket, and all the men decided to club together to pay the ticket for him, which was good. And I can remember standing outside beer kellers in Munich, because we were very young, drinking Cokes while the men were sort of inside lubricating their throats, So we did have some fun. The concerts we sang were slightly different in each place. And then, of course, the culmination was the Ottobrunn Abbey, which is a great Baroque Rococo cathedral. I mean, completely the other end of the spectrum from the wonderful modernity of Coventry Cathedral. Gilt and marble and frescoes, and frankly, a wee bit over the top for sort of boys coming from such a wonderful modern building. But it was an incredible place to sing.
Each place had a different kind of memory.
Yeah.
For me, Strasbourg was battered buildings and bullet holes. You could see where machine guns had torn chunks out of several of the buildings in the city centre of Strasbourg. And then at Ottobrunn, just being with Benjamin Britten, knowing that you got the great man there, listening to us singing what he had written, and then being aware that we were in the same building as European foreign ministers who had actually come to hear us give a concert the night before.
It was a reasonably new thing to have sort of touring choirs. The War Requiem itself is very difficult music, and one of the main parts that we had to sing, it's a prayer, and it's meant to be a sort of a lilting chorus, perhaps over the battlefield. We start off, and then the baritone and tenor soloists come in. And to give this effect, we were actually at the back of the church. We were in the organ loft, right at the back of the church. And there was a bit of a time delay, between the orchestra at the front and for us to sing. So technically, we had to be ready to sing perhaps half a beat before we were expecting. And allegedly, we sang the right note in the right time, and allegedly, Benjamin Britten said the boys did well. So, we're pleased.
He was delighted with what we did, because it was heard to say those wonderful boys. And when we got back here, he provided a huge box of chocolates saying thank you, which we only got one each, but it was really nice.
Yeah, it was a relief, because it was challenging. It's a challenging piece to sing,
When I was organising the 50th reunion, I spent 3 days in Wales in the house of Richard Sadler, the famous Coventry photographer. Richard was a magnificent photographer, and he came with us on our tours to Berlin and Ottobrunn. And one day I saw a photograph of me in the centre of a group of boys on the desk of a friend of mine. And I said, "Where the devil did you get that photograph?" He had no idea that I was the boy in the middle of the picture. He said, "Well, it's a Richard Sadler photograph." And I said, "Are there any more?" He said, "Not that I know of." So I tracked down Richard in Wales and discovered that in his lab he had locked away a huge Coventry Cathedral archive that he hadn't really looked at for years. He invited me and my wife to come and stay with him, and I spent 3 days using a magnifying glass to look at old negatives. And from a box of negatives I selected 60 what I thought would be the most interesting photographs and recommissioned them. I commissioned Richard to print them, and I brought all those prints to the reunion dinner and laid them all out for everybody to see. And they were marvellous photographs, and virtually everybody wanted to buy one or two. So it was a good job for Richard. He got a major commission out of it. But then some clever chap sort of said, "Mike, you've really got to write a book. You've got to do something with those photographs." So I went home and with my wife sat down and looked at the photographs and put them in some kind of chronological order. And then I realised that every photograph evoked a response from me. I then found Stephen Gadd, a chorister of Coventry Cathedral from about 20 years later than me, who for a short while ran a publishing company. And he produced the most marvellous copy of the book. He used the photographs so imaginatively to produce a wonderful cover. All of the lads gave me 50 quid. And that was enough to get 100 special edition copies made and 100 soft copies, which are still available on Amazon for anybody that's interested.
It was a great book, because as Mike said, the photos just put all the memories back, in order. Because you do remember bits of it, but of course, having something that really, fixes it again. Like I remember who I sat next to on the coach and that sort of thing. Really lovely, really was.